It was just another morning for Ava Thompson, a successful lawyer based in a busy city, where the hustle and bustle of everyday life made it hard to remember the times when things were simpler. As a black woman in a predominantly white industry, Ava had long been accustomed to navigating the subtle undercurrents of bias, but that didn't make it any easier. Still, she always tried to remain composed, knowing that her success in law and life had come through sheer determination and an unshakable belief in her own worth. Today was no different, or at least, it seemed that way at first. Ava had spent the week preparing for a high-stakes case that had required her to put in long hours. She had been working around the clock, balancing client meetings, paperwork, and court appearances. Now, she was finally heading home to her family after a demanding few days. A sense of relief washed over her as she stepped into the airport, the fluorescent lights and endless lines of travelers offering a sense of anonymity she couldn't find in her professional life. She was just another passenger today, and that was a luxury in itself. Ava approached the check-in counter, her carry-on bag rolling smoothly behind her. She had made it through the security checkpoint without incident and was feeling the pull of the vacation that awaited her at the other end of the flight. After all, she had earned this moment of respite. She wasn't in a rush, the world outside the terminal could wait. She stood in line at the gate, pulling her phone out of her purse to catch up on some emails. For a few moments, it seemed like she could just be a regular person, living a regular life, without the burden of expectations that often followed her wherever she went. The boarding call was announced, and Ava stood, ready to make her way onto the plane. She boarded with the usual calm efficiency, her focus remaining on her destination. But as she stepped into the cabin, she noticed the atmosphere shift, a subtle yet undeniable change. The flight attendants greeted her with practiced smiles, but there was something in their eyes, something that made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite place it. It wasn't outright hostility, but a coldness that she had learned to pick up on over the years, something that whispered she wasn't quite welcome. Even though her ticket was as valid as anyone else's. She took her seat near the back of the plane, near the window. Ava preferred this spot, as it gave her the privacy to settle into her thoughts and reflect on her week. As she buckled her seatbelt, she noticed the flight attendant who would be serving her section, a young woman with blonde hair pulled tightly into a ponytail, her uniform crisply ironed and spotless. She smiled at Ava in that same professional way, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that didn't quite match the warmth of the greeting. Ava returned the smile, but something in her gut told her that this flight wouldn't be like any other. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew there was something lurking just beneath the surface. Still, she pushed it to the back of her mind and tried to relax as the plane began to taxi down the runway. As the plane took off and ascended into the sky, Ava allowed herself to breathe deeply. The weight of the week began to lift, and the hum of the engines provided a soothing soundtrack to her thoughts. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to relax into the seat, but she soon noticed the flight attendant making her way down the aisle, approaching Ava's row. The woman's eyes briefly met Ava's, and then she looked away quickly, as if Ava had done something wrong by simply being there. It was a small thing, but Ava had learned to read these signs, these small gestures that communicated more than words ever could. The attendant leaned over Ava's seat to adjust the overhead compartment, brushing past her face just a little too closely, forcing Ava to lean back to avoid contact. "Excuse me," Ava said, trying to keep her tone polite despite the discomfort she felt. "Could you make sure my bag is secure in the overhead bin?" The attendant, who had been moving to the next row, turned back and looked at her with a dismissive expression. "It's fine," she said curtly, not bothering to check the compartment. Ava's stomach tightened. She had dealt with enough microaggressions in her life to know when something wasn't right. She forced herself to remain calm. Maybe it was just a bad day for the attendant. She was tired too, after all, and everyone had their moments of frustration. But the more Ava thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just a one-off moment. It was an attitude, a feeling, that had started when she first entered the cabin, and now it was becoming clear that this woman wasn't just being careless. She was actively ignoring Ava in a way that she hadn't done with any of the other passengers. Ava sat back in her seat, feeling the familiar sensation of being on edge, something she had often felt in spaces where people like her were a minority. But she didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to let this woman get under her skin. Ava had learned that if you showed any sign of resistance, it would only escalate things, and she wasn't about to give this attendant the satisfaction of knowing that she had gotten to her. But as the flight continued, things didn't improve. The flight attendant passed by several times, offering drinks and snacks to other passengers with a pleasant smile, but when she reached Ava's row, her face remained impassive, and her service felt noticeably colder. At one point, when the attendant stopped to check the seatbelt signs in the middle of the cabin, Ava caught her staring at her from the corner of her eye. There was something in the way she looked at Ava, something condescending, something that spoke volumes about how she saw her, a black woman on a plane who didn't belong in her eyes, no matter how much she had paid for the ticket or how much she had earned in life. This subtle yet constant disregard was the type of thing Ava had experienced countless times before: whispers, sideways glances, a sense of being invisible in spaces where she was supposed to belong. But this time, it felt different. The tension had been building ever since she had boarded the flight, and now, it was bubbling to the surface. Ava couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was going to turn into something bigger, something she couldn't ignore. She glanced around at the other passengers, wondering if anyone else had noticed the way the flight attendant had been treating her. No one seemed to care, though. A few passengers were engaged in their own conversations, others were scrolling through their phones, and one man at the front was already asleep. The cabin was quiet, and in that silence, just another passenger today. She was someone who had been wronged, and she knew that this flight, this day, was about to take a turn she hadn't seen coming. Va's discomfort began to grow. She was used to navigating uncomfortable situations, but this was starting to feel different. It wasn't just the flight attendant. It was the isolation, the reminder that she often had to fight twice as hard as anyone else to earn the respect she deserved. Ava adjusted in her seat, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But deep down, she knew this was going to be one of those moments when everything changed. She wasn't. The steady hum of the plane's engines provided an odd sense of calm for Ava, but the tension in her chest didn't seem to ease. She had been on countless flights before, each more or less blending together as an uneventful blur. But today felt different. As the plane ascended into the sky, lifting away from the ground and the city she had just left behind, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she was in the middle of something significant, something she had no control over. The flight attendant passed by her again, this time carrying a tray of drinks. She stopped right in front of Ava's seat and gave her an insincere smile. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her tone clipped. Ava nodded, trying to keep things light. "I'll have a water, please." The attendant barely looked at her as she handed over the drink, almost as if she was doing Ava a favor. It wasn't the service itself that bothered her, it was the coldness, the way the flight attendant treated her like she was an afterthought. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that would draw attention, but Ava felt it, and that was enough. As the attendant moved on to the next row, Ava took a sip of her water and let out a quiet breath. She was growing increasingly frustrated, but she didn't want to escalate things. Not yet. She didn't want to be labeled the angry black woman who caused trouble over something so small. Still, it gnawed at her. As the flight progressed, the attendant continued to pass by, offering drinks and snacks with a practiced air of politeness to the other passengers, but when she reached Ava's row, it was as though Ava wasn't even there. The lack of acknowledgement was maddening, and Ava's growing irritation began to cloud her thoughts. Was she being paranoid, or was this woman actually treating her differently? The question lingered in her mind, and Ava's attempt to remain calm started to crack. She glanced around at the other passengers in her row, who seemed oblivious to what was happening. The man beside her was engrossed in his book, while the woman in the aisle seat had her head buried in a magazine. No one seemed to notice or care. Ava tried to keep her frustration in check, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. It wasn't until the second round of beverage service that things took a more personal turn. The attendant approached Ava's seat with a slightly more forced smile than usual, this time carrying a small snack tray with pretzels and peanuts. She paused in front of Ava and, without a word, set the tray down on the armrest, not even making eye contact. The gesture felt so dismissive, so deliberate, that it was impossible to ignore. The attendant's hand brushed against Ava's elbow as she pulled away, a brief but unmistakable contact that made Ava flinch involuntarily. It was a small thing, but it felt like a punch. "Thank you," Ava said, her voice tight. She wasn't sure if she was speaking out of politeness or if it was a subtle attempt to call out the flight attendant's behavior. Either way, it seemed to fall flat. The attendant didn't respond, just gave her that same icy look and moved on to the next row, leaving Ava sitting there, stunned. The feeling of isolation deepened. Ava had been in situations before where she was treated as if she didn't belong, but this felt different. It wasn't just a slight, it was a palpable, deliberate disregard. The kind of thing that people who didn't have to constantly fight for respect would never notice, but it cut deep for Ava. She had been taught to ignore these moments, to rise above, to not let them dictate her actions or how she saw herself. But today, something in her wouldn't let it go. She sat back in her seat, the familiar discomfort of being othered creeping up on her. She wasn't even sure why she felt so angry. After all, it was just a flight attendant. It wasn't as though her life was being threatened, and it wasn't as if this was the first time she had faced discrimination, even if it was less overt. But this situation was different. The disregard she was feeling wasn't just about race, it was about respect. For the next few minutes, Ava tried to focus on the soft, steady whir of the plane, closing her eyes in an attempt to block out the frustration building in her chest. She let the moments pass by, one after another, as the flight attendant made her rounds, offering drinks and snacks to the other passengers. With each pass, the attendant's behavior seemed to grow colder, and Ava began to wonder if it was intentional. She started to doubt herself, to question if she was just being overly sensitive. Maybe it was her own fatigue, maybe she was reading too much into it. But as the flight continued, the behavior escalated. The attendant came by once more, this time with the meal cart. She barely glanced at Ava as she approached, continuing to serve the other passengers with a practiced smile. When she reached Ava's row, she stopped, looked at Ava for a brief moment, and then asked, "Are you sure you don't want anything to eat?" Ava, already feeling the tension from earlier, bit her lip and forced a polite smile. "No, thank you. Just water is fine," she replied. The attendant paused for a moment, as if sizing her up. Then, without another word, she pushed the cart down the aisle. There was no attempt to offer anything else, no acknowledgement, just a silent dismissal. Ava watched as the attendant continued down the aisle, engaging with other passengers who seemed to be receiving more friendly service. It was hard to ignore the stark contrast. The entire situation felt absurd. Here Ava was, a successful attorney, someone who had built a career fighting for justice, and yet in this moment, she was treated as though she didn't matter. It was as if her presence was a mere inconvenience to the flight crew, a distraction from the important passengers who were clearly more deserving of respect. Ava looked out of the window, watching as the clouds spread across the horizon, the endless expanse of sky making her feel even more small, more invisible. She wasn't the type of person to start conflicts. She wasn't the kind of person who made scenes. But today, she felt as though she had no choice but to stand up for herself. The small injustices were becoming too much to bear, too much to ignore. She had spent so much of her life learning to deal with the subtleties, the quiet forms of discrimination, but there were moments when it became too much. And today, it felt as though it was all coming to a head. She had spent so long working to prove herself, to rise above the biases and stereotypes that people held about her, and now, here she was, just a passenger on a flight, being made to feel as though she was nothing more than an afterthought. As she thought about it more, Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of anger bubbling up inside her. This wasn't just about being ignored by a flight attendant. It was about something deeper, something that had followed her for years, something she had fought against her whole life. She had been dismissed in ways big and small, but the truth was, it was harder to rise above when it happened over and over again. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, her mind racing with thoughts of how to respond. Should she speak up? Should she let it slide and just focus on getting through the flight? Would confronting the flight attendant escalate things, or would it show her that she couldn't be disrespected without consequence? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she didn't have an answer. But she knew that this moment was about to become something much bigger than a minor inconvenience on a plane. Something inside her stirred, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Her patience was wearing thin, and as the plane continued its journey, Ava knew that sooner or later, something was going to have to give. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, Ava's frustration grew more intense. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, a heaviness that seemed to intensify with every passing minute. It wasn't just the flight attendant's dismissive behavior anymore, it was everything that had led her to this moment. She had worked hard her entire life to get to where she was, fighting against obstacles, battling stereotypes, and constantly proving her worth in spaces that weren't built for her. But here, at 30,000 feet, it felt as though all of that effort was being erased in an instant by a woman who couldn't even look her in the eye. It wasn't just the way the attendant treated her, it was the feeling of being invisible, of being made to feel that her presence was nothing more than a nuisance. The more Ava thought about it, the angrier she became. She wasn't just angry at the flight attendant, she was angry at the world that allowed these subtle, systemic biases to fester and thrive. She was angry that she had to fight for respect every single day, that the color of her skin was still something people felt they could use as a measuring stick for her worth. Her mind began to race as the hours passed, and with each moment, her decision grew clearer. She wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. Not today. She had been patient for too long, trying to remain composed and quiet in the face of microaggressions and outright disrespect. But this was different. The flight attendant's actions had crossed a line. Ava wasn't just some anonymous passenger who could be ignored and mistreated. She was someone who had earned every right to be where she was, and she was not going to let this moment slip by without making her voice heard. The attendant came by again, pushing the drink cart down the aisle. Ava's heart raced as the woman neared her row. She had been waiting for this moment, and now it was here. As the attendant reached her seat, Ava decided that she was done being passive, done waiting for things to get better on their own. She stood up and looked the attendant directly in the eye. "I'm sorry, but I'd like to speak with the captain," Ava said, her voice calm but firm. There was no mistaking the seriousness in her tone. "I'm being treated differently, and I would appreciate it if someone could address it." The flight attendant's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly masked her reaction with a cold smile. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone suddenly shifting into a more defensive one. "There is," Ava replied, her voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline rushing through her veins. "You've been ignoring me all flight. I've been treated with disrespect, and I'm not going to tolerate it." The attendant hesitated, clearly thrown off guard by Ava's response. She glanced down the aisle as if to gauge whether anyone was paying attention. Ava could see the wheels turning in her head. Perhaps she was trying to decide how best to dismiss Ava, to make her feel small, as she had done so many times before. But Ava wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. Not today. "Please calm down," the attendant said, her voice tight, but there was a note of uncertainty there, something Ava didn't miss. "I'm just doing my job. "You're not doing your job," Ava shot back, her words sharp and measured. "You're treating me like I don't matter, and that's not acceptable. I paid for this ticket just like everyone else." The attendant's expression faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'll get the captain," she said, her voice laced with frustration, but she turned and walked briskly down the aisle without another word. Ava's heart was pounding in her chest as she sat back down, her thoughts swirling. She had taken a step that was hard to undo, and now she had to live with the consequences. The idea of confrontation had never been something she enjoyed. She was a problem solver, a negotiator by nature, but this was different. This was personal. It wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, invisible, or unworthy. This was the moment she had to choose whether or not she would stand up for herself, no matter the consequences. As she sat there, waiting for the captain to arrive, the other passengers started to take notice. The man in the seat next to her glanced over, his curiosity piqued by the tension in the air. He opened his mouth to speak but seemed to think better of it, opting instead to return to his book. Ava couldn't help but notice how the passengers around her seemed oblivious to what had been happening. They were either too distracted by their own concerns or too accustomed to the subtle forms of bias that existed in society. But Ava wasn't going to let them ignore it anymore. Moments later, the captain appeared at the front of the cabin, flanked by two other flight attendants. He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, his expression calm but firm. He looked down at Ava, his eyes taking in the situation, and then shifted his gaze to the flight attendant who had sparked the confrontation. The tension in the cabin was palpable as everyone held their breath, waiting to see how this would unfold. "Ava, is it?" the captain asked, his voice warm but authoritative. "I understand there's an issue that needs to be addressed." "Yes, there is," Ava replied, her voice unwavering. "I've been treated disrespectfully by this flight attendant. I was ignored, dismissed, and treated as though I wasn't even here. I've had enough." The captain nodded, his gaze flickering briefly to the flight attendant before returning to Ava. "I'm very sorry for your experience," he said, his tone sincere. "This is not the standard of service we aim to provide. I'll have a word with the crew and ensure that this is handled appropriately." Ava nodded, relieved that the captain seemed to take her concerns seriously. She had expected pushback, expected to be told she was overreacting or being too sensitive, but instead, she was being heard. The moment felt like a small victory, but it wasn't over yet. Ava knew that this was just the beginning of something larger, something that could ripple through the entire flight. As the captain turned and began speaking with the flight attendants, Ava's mind raced. She had made a choice, she had stood up for herself, and now she would have to see it through. What if the flight attendant retaliated? What if things got worse? What if she was dismissed as someone who was just making a scene? But Ava didn't care. She had fought too long and too hard to let this moment pass. She had to trust that doing the right thing was worth the risk. The world could be uncomfortable and unjust, but Ava knew she had to be the one to demand change, even in the smallest of moments. She couldn't let this be one of those times when she looked back and wished she had said something, had done something. The captain returned to his seat, his expression more serious now, and the flight attendant who had treated Ava so poorly looked visibly uncomfortable. The rest of the flight proceeded without incident, but Ava could feel the tension linger in the air. The flight was nearly over, and as the plane began its descent, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. This wasn't just another flight, it was a turning point, a moment that had shifted something inside her. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to gather their things, Ava sat back, her mind still processing everything that had happened. She had stood up for herself, but she had also stood up for something bigger, something that reached far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. She had made a choice to confront injustice, and in doing so, she had taken control of her narrative, her story. The question lingered in her mind: how would the world change if more people stood up like this? How many small moments of discomfort, of discrimination, could be avoided if people simply chose to speak out when they saw wrong? Ava didn't have all the answers, but she knew that this experience had changed her, and maybe, just maybe, it could change others too. The plane came to a full stop at the gate, and the passengers slowly began to exit, moving toward the terminal. Ava stood up, grabbed her bag, and made her way off the plane. As she stepped into the jet bridge, a small part of her smiled. She had done what needed to be done. And in that moment, Ava Thompson felt a little more at peace with herself. The next few days after the flight were a blur of emotions for Ava. She had never been one to seek confrontation, but in standing up for herself, she had opened a door she hadn't fully considered the consequences of. It wasn't just the flight attendant's cold reception that had left her feeling unsettled, it was the ripple effect of her actions, how her decision to challenge the status quo might reverberate far beyond her own personal experience. At first, she tried to push the incident out of her mind. She returned to her routine, meetings, case files, and the steady hum of her professional life, but the weight of the encounter lingered. Her phone buzzed in the middle of a briefing. It was an email from the airline, a generic apology, stating that they were investigating the matter and would ensure future training was more inclusive. It was a nice gesture, one that seemed designed to placate her, but Ava wasn't fooled. It wasn't just training that needed to change, it was the mindset behind the actions. Despite the company's reassurances, Ava found herself haunted by thoughts of what had transpired on that plane. She had made a stand, yes, but in doing so, she felt a new kind of vulnerability. The coldness of the flight attendant had been one thing, something she could chalk up to individual bias or carelessness. But the way the entire crew had reacted, how the captain had been so quick to try to smooth things over, made Ava feel like she was the one in the wrong. Had she overreacted? Was she too sensitive? In the quiet of her apartment, as she sorted through the details of the flight in her mind, she began to doubt herself. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that part of her anger wasn't just about how she was treated in that moment, it was about the years of similar experiences, the everyday microaggressions that she had learned to brush off. The systemic racism she had spent a lifetime navigating had become so deeply ingrained that it was now a part of her worldview. She had come to expect it. It wasn't something she always fought against, but in this moment, on that flight, she realized that it was time for her to challenge it more directly. The flight attendant's actions were just a reflection of something much bigger, something that could no longer be ignored. The fallout didn't take long to hit her. The next day, Ava was greeted with an unexpected email from her firm. It was a public relations request, asking her to make a statement about the incident. At first, she was taken aback. What did her law firm have to do with the flight incident? She wasn't looking for a platform to discuss the matter, nor did she want to turn this into some public spectacle. But her firm, always mindful of their high-profile clients, saw this as an opportunity to shape the narrative. This could be good PR for you, the email suggested. Your experience could resonate with the broader public and position you as a leader in this fight. Ava stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she considered the proposal. They were offering her a chance to speak out, to make her voice heard on a wider stage, but was it the right time? She had been fighting for justice in her own way, through her work as an attorney, but this was different. This wasn't just about the law, it was about personal dignity, about standing up to the day-to-day injustices that so many people face without ever saying a word. Her phone rang just then. It was her best friend, Lena, calling from back home. Ava let out a sigh of relief, grateful for a distraction. She picked up the phone, and Lena's voice was immediately a balm to her frazzled nerves. "So, I heard about what happened on the flight. Are you okay?" Lena's voice was filled with concern, but there was a hint of disbelief in it too. Ava sighed, sinking deeper into her couch. "I don't know, Lena. It's like, Everything's just been building up, you know? All these years of being told to just deal with it, to not rock the boat, and then that flight attendant. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore. I don't regret standing up for myself, but I also feel like everything's kind of spiraling. I didn't expect it to turn into this big thing. Lena paused, clearly weighing her words. Ava, you're an attorney. You fight for justice every day. What happened on that plane isn't just a random event, it's a reflection of everything you've been working against your whole life. And you know that, right? You've been fighting systemic racism and discrimination for years. This is just another part of that fight. Don't let them make you feel like you're overreacting. Ava let the words sink in. Her best friend was right. She had been pushing for equality her whole career, but it had always been in the context of the law, cases, legal battles, and clients. Now, this was personal. She wasn't fighting an abstract concept, she was fighting for her own dignity, for her own right to be seen and respected as an equal. But the fallout from the incident wasn't just about personal reflection. It soon became clear that others had been watching. On social media, posts began to surface about the incident. The airline had been tagged in several posts, with passengers sharing their experiences, offering both support for Ava and criticism of the flight attendant. Some people applauded Ava for standing up for herself, for refusing to be dismissed, while others took a more defensive stance, saying that she had blown things out of proportion. The debate quickly grew into a larger conversation about race, privilege, and respect in public spaces. Ava had inadvertently become the focal point of a conversation she hadn't expected to be part of. The hashtags #RespectAllPassengers and #StandUpForYourself began trending, and news outlets picked up the story. Ava found herself receiving messages from strangers, from activists, and even from people she had never met before, all offering their support or opinions. The weight of it all was starting to feel overwhelming. In the midst of the growing media storm, Ava's firm began to push harder for her to make a public statement. They saw an opportunity to elevate her profile, to position her as a spokesperson for racial justice in the corporate world. But Ava hesitated. She wasn't looking for fame. She wasn't even looking for validation. She had always believed that her work spoke for itself. But now, she was faced with a dilemma. If she remained silent, would it seem like she was backing down? Would it seem like she was ashamed of her decision to stand up for herself? Lena's voice echoed in her mind. This isn't just about you anymore, Ava. It's about something bigger. You've got a platform now, and you can use it to change things. Ava knew Lena was right. The fight wasn't just about one flight attendant or one incident. It was about all the times, in all the small moments, when people of color were overlooked, dismissed, or ignored. It was about challenging the norms that perpetuated inequality, even in the most seemingly innocuous situations. She had the opportunity now to be a voice for the voiceless, to turn her personal experience into something that could resonate with others. After a long night of contemplation, Ava made her decision. She would speak out. Not for the publicity or for the attention, but because it was the right thing to do. She owed it to herself, and to everyone who had ever faced the same kind of treatment, to share her story. She composed a statement, carefully choosing her words. In it, she talked about her experience on the flight, but she also framed it within the larger context of racial inequality. She spoke about the daily battles that Black people face, the constant need to prove themselves, and the emotional toll that it takes. She made it clear that the incident wasn't just about her, it was about the broader societal issue that needed to be addressed. And she ended the statement with a call to action, to challenge the subtle forms of discrimination that are so deeply ingrained in everyday life. The next day, Ava released the statement. It was picked up by news outlets, shared by activists, and discussed on social media. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with people from all walks of life expressing their support. But it was the personal messages that meant the most to her. Strangers reached out to thank her for speaking up, for giving voice to experiences they had long kept silent. Others shared their own stories of racial bias, and Ava realized that her small act of defiance had sparked a larger conversation, one that was just beginning. The fallout from the flight incident had turned Ava's life upside down, but it had also given her a chance to be a part of something much bigger than herself. As the days passed, she found herself filled with a sense of purpose she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about a movement, a call for respect and equality in every corner of society. Ava had taken a stand, and in doing so, she had become part of something that was changing the world. She composed a statement, carefully choosing her words. In it, she talked about her experience on the flight, but she also framed it within the larger context of racial inequality. She spoke about the daily battles that Black people face, the constant need to prove themselves, and the emotional toll that it takes. She made it clear that the incident wasn't just about her, it was about the broader societal issue that needed to be addressed. And she ended the statement with a call to action, to challenge the subtle forms of discrimination that are so deeply ingrained in everyday life. The next day, Ava released the statement. It was picked up by news outlets, shared by activists, and discussed on social media. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with people from all walks of life expressing their support. But it was the personal messages that meant the most to her. Strangers reached out to thank her for speaking up, for giving voice to experiences they had long kept silent. Others shared their own stories of racial bias, and Ava realized that her small act of defiance had weeks passed, and the story continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Ava had made her decision, and the world was taking notice. What had begun as a solitary confrontation with a dismissive flight attendant had evolved into a larger conversation about race, privilege, and the subtle ways systemic discrimination manifested in everyday life. Ava's decision to speak out had not only challenged the individual incident but also sparked a broader, more urgent dialogue. She had become an unwitting leader in a movement she had never intended to start. Ava's personal life, however, had taken on a different shape since that fateful flight. She was no longer simply a lawyer, quietly working behind the scenes to represent her clients. Her role had transformed. Ava was now a spokesperson, a voice for those who had been made to feel invisible, dismissed, or less than. She had been thrust into a public sphere, and with that came a sense of responsibility she hadn't fully anticipated. While part of her felt empowered, another part of her longed for the simplicity of her old life, where her worth wasn't constantly under scrutiny. The first few days of this new reality were overwhelming. Ava had given interviews, participated in panel discussions, and written op-eds. She'd become a focal point for activists and organizations advocating for racial equality, and her voice sparked a larger conversation, one that was just beginning. The fallout from the flight incident had turned Ava's life upside down, but it had also given her a chance to be a part of something much bigger than herself. As the days passed, she found herself filled with a sense of purpose she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about a movement, a call for respect and equality in every corner of society. Ava had taken a stand, and in doing so, she had become part of something that was changing the world. Weeks passed, and the story continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Ava had made her decision, and the world was taking notice. What had begun as a solitary confrontation with a dismissive flight attendant had evolved into a larger conversation about race, privilege, and the subtle ways systemic discrimination manifested in everyday life. Ava's decision to speak out had not only challenged the individual incident but also sparked a broader, more urgent dialogue. She had become an unwitting leader in a movement she had never intended to start. Ava's personal life, however, had taken on a different shape since that fateful flight. She was no longer simply a lawyer, quietly working behind the scenes to represent her clients. Her role had transformed. Ava was now a spokesperson, a voice for those who had been made to feel invisible, dismissed, or less than. She had been thrust into a public sphere, and with that came a sense of responsibility she hadn't fully anticipated. While part of her felt empowered, another part of her longed for the simplicity of her old life, where her worth wasn't constantly under scrutiny. The first few days of this new reality were overwhelming. Ava had given interviews, participated in panel discussions, and written op-eds. She'd become a focal point for activists and organizations advocating for racial equality, and her voice had resonated with thousands of people who had shared similar experiences. But as much as she appreciated the support and recognition, Ava found herself facing an internal conflict. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay focused on her work and her clients, but now, every action, every word, seemed to carry a weight that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the media attention, though that was certainly difficult to navigate, it was the way people started to look at her, with expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. Her family had been supportive throughout the process, but even they could sense her internal struggle. Her mother, who had always encouraged her to use her voice for change, had a conversation with her one evening that stayed with Ava long after. "You've always known what you were meant to do, Ava. You've always known what it takes to fight for justice, for what's right. This is just a new chapter for you. But remember, you don't have to carry the world on your shoulders. You're still allowed to just be you." Those words hung in the air long after the conversation ended. Ava realized she had been carrying the weight of this newfound responsibility as if it were a burden. The truth was, she had spent her entire life fighting for others, whether it was in the courtroom or within her community. But this fight for her own dignity and respect, was one she hadn't fully prepared for. She wasn't sure how to balance the weight of her public persona with her personal need for peace. The phone calls from media outlets continued, and soon Ava found herself being asked to speak at national rallies. Her firm had seen the potential in her newfound visibility, encouraging her to use the platform to make a lasting impact. "Ava, this is your moment," one of her senior colleagues had said during a conference call. "You have the ability to change the narrative, to influence the way we talk about race in this country. People are listening." And Ava had started to listen too. The conversations she was having weren't just about legal strategies anymore. They were about systemic change. They were about giving people the courage to speak out against injustice, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. She had received messages from individuals who had experienced similar microaggressions, from people who had spent their entire lives navigating the small daily battles she had faced herself. And while she had always thought of herself as a quiet fighter, someone who worked within the system to make incremental change, this felt different. She was being asked to take on a leadership role, one that involved stepping outside the system she had once been so comfortable with. It was during one of these rallies, a large gathering organized to address racial inequality in public spaces, that Ava finally understood the full extent of what she had done. As she stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, a sense of awe washed over her. The crowd wasn't just made up of people who looked like her, it was diverse, representing every race, background, and experience. The room was filled with people who had come together because they had heard her story, because they had recognized the deep resonance in her words. It wasn't about a single flight or a single flight attendant anymore. It was about the broader issue of human dignity, of creating spaces where people were seen for who they truly were, not just for the labels society had placed on them. Her speech, which began as a personal reflection on the flight incident, quickly grew into a call to action. Ava spoke about her own experiences, about the subtle discrimination she had faced throughout her career, about the countless times she had been forced to prove herself when others took her worth for granted. But she didn't just stop at sharing her pain. She spoke of hope, of the possibility for change. She spoke about the power of people coming together to challenge what was no longer acceptable. She spoke about the importance of collective action, of standing up, even in the smallest moments, to create a world where everyone could thrive. The response was overwhelming. Ava received messages from across the country, from people who had heard her words and found themselves emboldened to speak out as well. It was clear that her actions had ignited something within them, a spark that had been waiting to catch fire. But there was something else, something deeper, that Ava began to feel. It wasn't just the recognition or the praise that she found fulfilling. It was the change in herself, the realization that by standing up for her own dignity, she had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of those around her. Ava's transformation wasn't just about her public persona, it was about how she viewed herself, how she saw her place in the world. She had spent so much of her life trying to blend in, trying to conform to expectations and standards that didn't fit her. But this experience had forced her to embrace the parts of herself she had always tried to hide. The strong, unapologetic part of herself that refused to be ignored. The part of herself that knew that no matter the circumstances, she deserved respect, just like anyone else. In the months that followed, Ava became more involved in community work, using her newfound platform to push for change in areas where she knew she could make a real difference. She worked with schools to implement more inclusive curricula, with organizations to address workplace discrimination, and with local communities to provide resources for people facing systemic inequities. It was in these moments, when she saw the tangible effects of her advocacy, that she realized how much more she had to offer the world. But even as Ava's life took on a new purpose, she never forgot the lesson she had learned that fateful day on the plane. The fight for dignity, respect, and equality wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition, it was about the small moments, the everyday actions, that slowly, over time, chipped away at the walls of discrimination. It was about speaking out when it mattered, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against you. As she sat down one evening, reflecting on everything that had transpired, Ava couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. She had made the right decision, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. She had been a catalyst for change, and in doing so, she had found her true calling. The journey had been long and filled with unexpected twists, but Ava knew that the road ahead was still just beginning. And though she didn't have all the answers, she had learned one undeniable truth: change didn't happen by staying silent. It happened when people found the courage to speak up, to stand tall, and to refuse to accept anything less than respect and equality for all. She was no longer just a passenger in life, she was an active participant in shaping the world around her, one moment at a time. As time moved on, Ava's life settled into a rhythm that was both rewarding and humbling. The attention from the media and the public had quieted down, but the internal transformation she had undergone during the previous months continued to shape her in ways she never could have imagined. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore, or even an activist, she had become a symbol for change. People saw her as a beacon of hope, a reminder that individual actions could ripple outward, affecting society in profound ways. But what did that mean for Ava herself? What did it mean to carry this newfound sense of purpose? For a long time, Ava had tried to balance her work in the courtroom with her personal life. Now, her personal life had become intertwined with her work in ways she hadn't anticipated. She spent her days meeting with clients, advocating for policy changes, and working to establish programs that would make real, systemic changes. But there was always this nagging feeling at the back of her mind, the knowledge that the world was watching. Not in a way that was burdensome, but in a way that held her accountable. She could no longer afford to turn a blind eye to the broader issues that impacted those around her. One day, as Ava was sitting in her office, she received an email that would set the course for the next chapter of her life. It was from a well-known organization advocating for civil rights reform, and they had been following her journey. They offered her a position as their lead legal advisor, a role that would allow her to directly shape policy at a national level. It was an offer many would have jumped at, but for Ava, the decision wasn't clear-cut. This wasn't just a job, it was a life-altering decision. Taking the position would mean leaving her law firm, leaving behind her clients, and stepping into a larger arena where the stakes were even higher. The pressure to succeed would be immense, but so would the potential for impact. As she read through the email again, Ava thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. It had all started with one seemingly small act of defiance on a plane, a moment of standing up for herself in the face of disrespect. What had begun as an individual experience had grown into something much bigger. She had inspired others to speak out, and her words had been amplified in ways she hadn't imagined. Now, she had the chance to truly make a difference on a larger scale. But it wasn't just about professional advancement. It was about the legacy she wanted to leave behind. What kind of mark did she want to make on the world? Would she be content with her personal success, or would she choose to fight for systemic change that would outlast her? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her office door. It was Lena, her best friend, who had been a constant source of support throughout Ava's transformation. Ava had always been able to count on Lena for her honesty, and today was no different. "You've got that look on your face again," Lena said, walking into the room and setting down a cup of coffee on Ava's desk. "What's going on?" Ava hesitated for a moment, looking at the offer letter in front of her. "It's this," she said softly. "I've been offered a position with the Civil Rights Reform Initiative. They want me to be their lead legal advisor. It's everything I've worked for, but it means leaving everything I've built here. I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility." Lena sat down across from Ava, her expression thoughtful. "Ava, you're already doing this. You've been doing this for a long time. This is just a bigger platform. It's not about the title, it's about the work you'll be able to do, the lives you'll be able to change. You've always known that your purpose is bigger than just one person or one case. You have the chance to influence policy, to make real, lasting change. Don't let fear hold you back. You have everything it takes." Ava let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had always been someone who questioned her own abilities, second-guessed her decisions, and worried about making the wrong choice. But Lena's words hit her in a way that made everything seem clearer. Ava had spent her career fighting for justice, and now, she had the opportunity to make that fight more than just an individual endeavor. It could be the foundation for larger, structural change. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the future. The next few days were filled with reflection. Ava spent hours reviewing the impact her decision could have. She researched the organization, spoke with colleagues, and even took time to revisit the memories of her own upbringing, those early years when she had watched her family struggle against the inequalities of society. She thought of the moments when she had felt powerless, when she had wished for someone to stand up and fight for change. And now, she was in a position to be that someone. It was overwhelming, but it was also empowering. She knew that this could be the turning point not just for her career, but for her purpose in life. Ava decided to take the position. It was one of the hardest decisions she had ever made, but it felt right. She knew the responsibility that came with it, but she also knew that she couldn't turn away from the opportunity to effect real change. In the weeks that followed, Ava transitioned into her new role. The work was challenging, and the hours were long, but the sense of fulfillment she felt at the end of each day was unlike anything she had experienced before. She worked tirelessly with lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and grassroots movements to draft legislation aimed at dismantling discriminatory policies and creating equal opportunities for marginalized communities. As Ava settled into her new role, the impact of her work became evident. She helped push for changes in employment practices, advocated for criminal justice reform, and worked on education policies that would ensure equitable access for all students. Her contributions weren't just limited to legal work. She became a figurehead for the movement, speaking at rallies, organizing protests, and standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had once felt voiceless. But the most profound change came when Ava found herself in front of a group of young law students at a national civil rights conference. The students, many of whom came from diverse backgrounds, looked at her with admiration, not just because of her legal expertise, but because she had shown them that they could make a difference too. As she spoke about her journey, from that single moment on the plane to her work in policy reform, Ava realized that her story wasn't just about one person. It was about an entire generation of individuals who were watching, learning, and taking inspiration from her actions. Her legacy had begun to form, not just as a lawyer or an activist, but as a catalyst for change. Ava had realized that the work she was doing wasn't about recognition or accolades, it was about making the world a place where everyone had the opportunity to be seen, heard, and valued. And in that realization, she understood that her fight was far from over. The struggles were long and ongoing, but now, more than ever, she had the tools, the platform, and the resolve to continue pushing for justice. As the years passed, Ava's efforts bore fruit. The policies she had helped craft led to real changes in the way the country approached civil rights issues. Discrimination in hiring and education slowly started to diminish, though Ava knew the fight was far from finished. The true legacy she had created wasn't in the laws she helped pass, but in the countless lives she had touched, those who now had the courage to stand up for themselves, to demand respect, and to create change in their own communities. Ava had become part of a larger movement, one that transcended her individual experiences and grew into something powerful, something that would continue long after she had left the stage. As she sat in her office one evening, reflecting on everything that had come before and everything still to come, Ava felt at peace. She had done what she set out to do. She had transformed from an individual fighting for her own dignity into a leader fighting for the dignity of others. And while the road ahead was still filled with challenges, she knew that as long as there were people who were willing to stand up and speak out, change would continue to unfold, one step at a time.